One line in the film, The Agony and the Ecstasy, about Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel, no doubt written to provoke the audience, is when the female character asserts the dignity of women as made in God's image, along with the man. Michelangelo responds to her, God made man in his own image. Woman he made from a rib. But it's interesting, despite the distinctions that are made, and even the anthropological distinctions of God taking the woman from the rib as opposed to the head or the heel, indicating an equality in dignity with the man, we have in the last few days been listening to the stories of creation in the Scriptures. The first story covers the 6 days of creation, in which God rested on the seventh. The second story, with very distinct differences from the first, is not a more detailed account of the first, because it doesn't make any distinction of 6 days. And where in the first story, man and woman are created together and last of everything before the day of rest, in this story of creation, everything is created, then man, then all the animals, then the woman. So it's a different story that came from a different tradition of the ancient Hebrew faith and belief. But it's important to also note what is said in these stories, because these stories came out of the Jewish tradition following the experience of exile. The story of the exile is one hopefully we're familiar with. Historically, 49 years, or the better part of a generation, biblically 70 years, were spent with the people of Israel in exile in Babylon, a very large, powerful, pagan society and pagan culture, with its own pagan pantheon of gods, with its own stories of mythology and heroism, with its own understandings of the cosmos and the divinities that are involved in it. And an entire generation grew up in this environment and would have heard these stories. And the problem of the Jewish people would be, upon their return, to counter those stories about the divinities and about our place in creation with our own stories that don't so much tell us exactly what happened, but help to teach the faith of the Jewish people based upon their covenant with God that was built upon the covenant with Abraham and ultimately with Moses, and the relationship of love that God has with His people. And to give you an example of the differences between both stories out of Babylon and out of Israel, in a nutshell, the story of the creation of humanity that comes out of the Mesopotamian and Babylonian cultures tells the story that man sprung from the blood of the losing side after the battle between the gods. So there was a battle between the gods. One side was victorious, the other side was not, and we sprung from the blood of the losers. Which gives you an idea of what our place is before the gods who were victorious. They would not look upon us with great fondness. And our worship, our sacrifices, our understanding of our place in creation would be according to that story. Very defensive, very antagonistic. Then what do we have from the Hebrew or Jewish tradition? No war between the gods, no blood from the losers, but rather God kneeling down, building us from the clay of the earth, and breathing His life into us. That's the story that the Hebrews told. And in terms of the creation of woman and her place beside the man and in creation, not taken from the head or the heel, but taken from the side of the man, to stand with dignity with the man. And as we hear the story of, this is the perfect companion for the man. Not the other animals, but the woman. And the man, the perfect companion for the woman herself. The two becoming one flesh, as God intended them to be, in the sacrament of love as we understand it as church, but in matrimony, which we understand to be something basic to our humanity from the very, very beginning. How it happened, historically or scientifically, I always like to say, I don't know, I wasn't there. And when it comes between the stories of Scripture, the stories of evolution and science, how it happened, frankly, is God's problem, not ours. We're here. We see the finished product. We know the relationship we have with our God, and we know our place in creation. And the stories of creation tell that story, and even to today, counter much of what we hear from secular society and the secular cultures about humanity's place in creation. The rabid environmentalist movement does not see humanity as the crown jewel of God's creation, but more or less the wart, the bane. But our faith says otherwise. Made in God's image and likeness, man with the woman have a God-like stewardship over creation, being made in God's image and likeness. Not so much as the history might say it, but as the stories that stem from our faith and understanding of our relationship with God says it. So even as it spoke to the Jewish people coming home from Babylon, these stories continue to speak to us today in the midst of a secular, progressive society in which humanity is looked down upon as a curse and a bane in creation. Some who would say creation would be much better off without the scourge of humanity that does such damage to the environment. And as we as a church prepare to receive an encyclical by our Holy Father on, as some put it, global climate change, I often wonder, is it really going to be on global climate change, or is it going to be an encyclical on our place in creation, the glory of God's creation, and the responsibility that we have as human beings made in God's image and likeness to exercise proper and divinely inspired stewardship, God-like stewardship over creation. From a love we have of creation, just as God has a love for us and all of creation, which He called good. And so we hear these stories again of God creating humanity, the conclusion of which we hear today of God creating woman and making her that perfect helpmate for the man. Let us be renewed in our place in creation as we continue our lives within this creation, to always recognize God's glory in creation, so that we, in what small or large ways, made in God's image and likeness, can exercise responsibly and lovingly our God-like stewardship over God's creation.